So welcome back, everybody. I hope you enjoyed your breakfast, lunch or supper or whatever it was you're having in your particular time zone. Welcome back to the second session here. Just one thing to note, we're getting quite a lot of questions coming into the Q&A box, which is great, but we don't always have sufficient time to take everybody's questions. Don't let that deter you or make you despondent. Please keep putting your questions in there. If we're not able to take your question at the time, we're going to save all the questions up, certainly distribute them to the relevant speakers, and then hopefully put all questions and answers on the Centre for Printing History website afterwards. So please do keep your questions coming. So welcome to North America, who I think is just joining us at this stage. You're very welcome. I will pass on to Renata, who is moderating our first session this afternoon. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Our first speaker in this afternoon's session is Persida Lazarevic. I hope she's here.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
Hi, everybody. Yeah.
Super. Okay, she is an associate professor of Serbian and Croatian language and literature at the University di Annunzio Chieti Pescara, Italy. Her research interest includes South Slavic enlightenment, Italian-South Slavic relations, South Slavic oral traditions, and contemporary Serbian literature. She is also a member of the Italian Association of Slavists, the Italian Association for the Study of Southeast Europe, the Bexwell Society, the British Society for 18th Century Studies, and the Italian Association for the Study of the 18th Century. The presentation is titled Our Space, Our Time, Venetian and Greek Typography with Illyrian Characters. So, Persida.
Okay, thank you very much. Hi, everybody. And I try to share my screen, right? I try to share my screen. So, okay. Okay. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, you see my PowerPoint presentation, right?
No, we don't see it.
Now? Okay.
Yes.
Right?
Now
Okay,
we...
okay. It's out of space, out of time, Venetian Greek typography with Illyrian characters. The cultural centers of Illyrians, and I'm talking about here in this occasion, I'm talking about Orthodox Illyrians, Orthodox South Slavs. They were all in the past centuries. I don't know why I can move my presentation. I cannot move it. Okay. They were all outside the territories they inhabited. Mount Athos, Buda, Venice, Vienna, and Leipzig. Among these cities, Venice holds a place of prominence because for centuries it was a center of printing houses, and Illyrians did not have printing houses within their own territories, within the territories they inhabited. Except, for example, Trnavich printing house in Montenegro, 3 years, it lasted 3 years at the end of the 15th century. For English travelers, visiting Italy meant the Grand Tour. Actually, Italy was practically synonymous with the Grand Tour. This phenomenon obviously did not concern the Orthodox Illyrians, who, even though they frequented or perhaps lived in Italy, especially in Venice, left very few descriptions and impressions of this city, as if paradoxically it did not strike them, as if they took it for granted. This city on the lagoon, wonderful in many ways, was not a source of touristic attraction for the Illyrians. This was probably because they had neither the money nor the time for leisure, and they did not have time because they were rushing forward at great speed to offer their people the necessary culture to catch up with the West. They were actually aware that their culture was lacking books, and books, I mean, the lack of books was actually the culture hunger. Venice, therefore, with its numerous printing houses, was the ideal place for the Illyrians, a kind of Eden. In the Renaissance, we have the most important typographer, Aldo Manuzio, right? And he was the first publisher in the modern sense. And later we have Pezzana, Zane, Occhi, Orlandini. They all hosted, actually, almost all hosted Illyrian books. After a period of crisis in the 17th century, up until the mid-19th century, Venice meant typography for the Illyrians, which means Venice was typography. This association of Venice with typography was further enhanced with a strong association between Venetian typography and Theodosius printing house, which means Venice means typography, typography means Theodosio printing house. In August 1754, a Greek named Theodosius asked to be registered with the Guild of Bookstores and Printers and offered to set up a printing company with the Illyrian characters. Illyrian letters, demanding a 20-year privilege of printing with exemption from any taxes. The creation of this printing company was in response to growing market for books printed in Illyrian, which consisted primarily of liturgical books that followed the Greek rite. From that moment onwards, Theodosius printing house became the point of reference for the Slavs, a sort of enclave for them in Venice. It was as if the rest of Venice no longer existed, it no longer held any interest for them. Their interest was drawn to the printing house of Theodosius. So Venice was typography, typography meant Theodosius. It was such simple for them. That printing house in Venice came to be regarded as a sort of extraterritorial Slavia, a cultural outpost located outside the territories inhabited by Slavs. And we can see that it was in Sestiere Castello, in the part of Venice that is named even today. And today we have a hotel instead of typography. And Illyrians lived in the same Sestiere, in the same part of the city as, for example, Greeks or Poles and so on. And so we can find a lot of, for example, the part of the city from San Marco to, let's say, Biennale, where we can find a lot of Greek churches, for example. Here, and not in the Balkans, the Orthodox Illyrians could print with their own characters, which means Glagolitic characters, typically Slavic characters, Glagolitic alphabet and Cyrillic alphabet. This one is particularly from one of the Theodosius books, Theodosius Primaries. Thus, thanks to this printing house, Zachary Orfelin, for example, and later Pavle Solorich, the former representative of the Baroque and the later straddling the line between Enlightenment and Romanticism, found work as proofreaders and also took advantage of the opportunity to publish their texts either independently or as paratextual elements, which means it was because of the financial aspect. I mean, some of them just could not publish their books. So at the moment when some of the books were published, they just added paratextual elements because probably it was the cost of the book did not change, actually. This is a primary from Theodosius printing house. This is, for example, a history of Peter I. And here we have a poem published, and not only for Theodosius printing house, not all those that were published by Theodosius printing house. Some of those books in Venice were published or with so-called fake data, fake place, or without place. Because why? Because especially for the Orthodox, publishing in the West was not so acceptable in some way. So if they put the place publishing, sometimes they just put Moscow, for example, so it was fake. We see another primer, and here again we see a philological, the first philological text, and here the printing house of Theodosius regularly published its catalogs like the other printing houses. And one of the most interesting of these was this one, that you can see on your screens. The catalog of Illyrian texts edited by Solarich. Of more interest by Solarich, which is almost 3 times bigger than the catalog itself, where he gives the history, he gives us the history of Slavic printing, as well the history of the writing activity among Slavs, and in particular of the Southern Slavs. Actually, he arguments the most important Slavic question in the past. Which one is the mother language of all Slavs? Because all other languages all Slav languages are considered to be dialects of that mother language. And what that mother language is actually supposed to be the so-called Illyrian. But at the end of the 18th century, when Joseph Guttbock, publishing house in Vienna, obtained the monopoly to publish Slavic books, Vienna slowly attracted more and more Slavic authors. And in the 19th century, the attention shifted to the capital of the Austrian monarchy. Venice, at that point, would remain a perennial memory, becoming a part of culture and history of Slavs. And then, only then, would Venice become the object of their gazes and their writings. From being a Slavic Illyrian typographical enclave, Venice for the Illyrians would turn into the postcard city, just as it was for the Western visitors, for most of Western visitors, homologating to Western impressions and not infrequently on the border of becoming a cliché. Thank you. Can you see me now? Okay, yeah. Do you see me or my PowerPoint presentation?
You're muted, Renata.
Can you see me now?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, thank you very much, Priscilla.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It was very interesting presentation. I will come back to you in the question time. Our next speaker is Dermot McQueen. He gained his primary degree and early experience as a graphic designer in the United States, where he later held the position of art director of the University of Iowa Press and Publication Department. He was awarded his doctorate from Trinity College, Dublin. He is retired senior lecturer and head of Department of Fine Art and Visual Communication Design at the Technology University of Dublin, and he presently serves on the curatorial committee of the National Print Museum of Ireland. Dermot will take us towards a typographic national identity of Ireland. Please.
Yeah. Can you see me? No?
We can see you.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you, Renata, for that introduction. And thanks to the organizers of this event for giving me the opportunity to speak. I wish to talk about the relationship between language, or more specifically, the printing of language, and the development of a national identity. With this in mind, I intend looking at some of the more significant Irish character printing typefaces in a timeline with the various related political, mainly revolutionary events that helped shape this identity. And I hope that my words will not seem unduly bellicose in this context. Now, I'm open to correction, but in my opinion, it is unlikely that there can be any small nation that has had its identity so shaped by language as was the case in Ireland. I want to share screen. Share. Is that working? Well, I'm not sure. You're sharing screen, but I'm not seeing myself. Is that working all right, Renata? Can you see me and my images?
We can see your images, but we can't see your face. Or if it's okay with you.
Okay. You can see my face now, but not my images, I think. Is that right? In Ireland, there is a distinct and ancient language, Gaeilge, and while it's not widely spoken now, it is nonetheless the official first language of the country. Now, to express this language in print, there was in the past a unique alphabet. I'm just concerned that people are not seeing my images here. Are they, Renata?
We can see your images.
Okay, thank you. Okay. And now to express this language in print, there was in the past a unique alphabet. This came to use just 18 basic letter forms, but to extend their phonetic range, a complex system of diacritical marks of aspiration, accent, and ligature contractions was used. Now, despite some more exotic theories, this alphabet had its origin in the Roman. A Roman arrested in time is how Stanley Morrison of the Monotype Corporation rightly put it. This static state was in part due to a nostalgic and conservative, yet very real appreciation of the calligraphic skills of the early monastic scribes. Throughout history, the language presented an ongoing problem for the conquering forces as it fostered a nationalistic rejection of the imposed regulations. Under Anglo-Norman domination, all interaction between the English settlers and the native Irish was forbidden, and the English language alone was permitted in all affairs of state. This oppression was intensified in Tudor times, with death proposed as a penalty for those found speaking Irish. Penal laws were introduced, and insofar as they succeeded, they also drove the population into a greater awareness of their own national identity. The bardic poets posed a particular threat in their denouncement of the imposed settlers. Theirs was mainly an oral expression of song, loose verse, and storytelling, often accompanied by the harp. They were outlawed, and an infamous order issued: hang the harpers wherever found and burn their instruments. Now, the harp, and not the shamrock, went on to be adopted as the official emblem of the country. Now, this repression of the native language and customs created a dilemma for the establishment, as it sought to promote the religious doctrine of the Reformed Protestant Anglican Church in a largely Irish-speaking, unreceptive congregation. Now, do I need to say next slide here? But Queen Elizabeth I realized that some compromise was necessary. I'm just not seeing any of my slides here, so I'm wondering if I'm on the right one. Queen Elizabeth I realized that some compromise was necessary. Consequently, in 1571, she instructed that this Irish typeface be prepared for the printing of required religious texts. This type...
Sorry, Mr. Dermot McGinney, shall we forward your slides? Would that be
please.
Fine with
that
you?
Would be good. Yeah,
okay. Could you tell us, because we have now the screen with the slides,
okay.
Could you tell us from which slide on we should go?
Well, okay, well, I think I need one with the Queen Elizabeth type, if you can recognize that. Probably not, but it's the second slide in my...
The second slide.
Yeah. Okay. Now, Queen Elizabeth I realized that some compromise was necessary. Consequently, in 1571, she instructed that this Irish typeface be prepared for the printing of required religious texts. This type was made up from existing Roman with newly designed Irish letters added. It was used in the first instance to print this catechism and later to print other religious works in Irish. That's the first one. If you could go to the next one, please, there. Yeah. But I'm seeing my first slide. That's the one I want now. Thank you. In this manner, the story of the so-called Irish character printing types began. Now, this was also a time of considerable political unrest, an unrest that persisted throughout the ages. These events related either directly or indirectly to the language, and by extension to the development of Irish printing types. Whether this relationship is of real significance to my thesis or not, I will leave to your own judgment. Now, generally, These early types were prepared for the purpose of printing religious texts, or indeed frequently for language primers, lexicons, and the likes. They were more often than not prepared for a specific purpose and frequently reflected the stylistic preferences of their sponsor. Now, I'm aware there's quite a lot going on in some of these slides, but I really hope that they'll serve as a more general visual background rather than my going into detail on them, because I really don't have the time on this occasion. Now, this was the case, next slide please. This was the case regarding this type, prepared for the Irish Franciscans in exile. They had established their Irish college in Louvain in 1606, and they set up a printing press a few years later. The type was cut at the Planton Foundry in Antwerp by an Irishman, Thomas Strong, who worked there at the time. Now, the Franciscans deployed the type to print their Catholic religious works to counter the publication efforts of the Reformed Church back in Dublin. English authorities were so concerned at this development that their agent in Brussels was instructed to demand that the Archduke Albert not only close off the work at the college press, but also that all the books already produced there be seized and destroyed. The type, as we can see here, was based on the handwriting style of Bonaventure Hussey, who was the author of this catechism shown on the right, where it was first used. And the top of this slide shows a recently uncovered synopsis of the complete font, which, as I said, would initially just have 18 letters, but this includes all the special characters. Now, next slide, please. Another type based on the font we have just looked at was linked, albeit indirectly, with another major political event. Following the rebellion of 1641, the planned printing of Bishop William Bedell's translation of the Old Testament into Irish was deferred, and after the bishop's death, it remained untouched for over 40 years. By this time, the scientist Robert Boyle had this type cut to carry out the project. Boyle turned to Joseph Moxon, a mathematician colleague and type founder trading in London, to prepare his type. It was used in 1680 for the first time, and later in 1685, seen on the left of the slide, for Bishop Bedell's translation of the Old Testament, for which purpose it had been prepared. Excuse me. It will be of particular interest to type historians that these punches, shown on the right, remain the earliest extant known to have been cut in England. Next slide, please. Excuse me. The denial of formal education for Catholics during the 17th and 18th centuries led to the operation of so-called hedge schools and to the establishment of higher-level Irish colleges in Europe. One such college in Paris felt it necessary to devise a printing type in order to counteract the developing trend of many of the seminarian students from remaining on in Paris after graduation, in part due to a loss of fluency in Irish. Conor O'Begley, who helped design the type, provided his own handwriting in this cursive typographic style, which he hoped would be more agreeable to English readers as well. Next slide, please. The lead up to the turn of the 18th century was one of huge turmoil, culminating in the rebellion of 1798. The eventual defeat of the rebels and the slaughter of many thousands led to the passing of the Act of Union between Ireland and Great Britain. This in turn resulted in a huge increase in the proselytizing efforts of the Protestant religions. New typefaces were needed to meet the demand of the Hibernian and the British and Foreign Bible Societies. The Hibernian Bible Society considered the pros and cons of using the Irish character as distinct from the Roman for the reprinting of their religious texts, and conducted what I guess we would now call a consumer survey or opinion poll directed at the elite Reverend clergymen, gentlemen of experience. One response from the warden of Galway Jail, this building that you see on the slide, in support of the Irish character, indicated that he distributed copies of the Bible in the Roman character. When he did that, he had to promise to replace them with Irish character versions as soon as he could. And that when a reader was brought in to read to those who could not, when it was noticed that the Roman or English type, as it was frequently called, was used, the inmates lost interest in listening. Next slide, please. Perhaps the single most significant event in the world of 19th century book production in Ireland was the publication of John O'Donovan's edition of the Annals of the Kingdom of Ireland by the Four Masters. Of related significance was the production of this Irish character typeface for its printing, seen on the bottom of this slide. The designer was the artist George Petrie, who produced a type that achieved a quality that matched many of the well-designed contemporaneous Roman faces. His design was modelled on early Christian stone inscriptions and metal engravings, and on the half-uncial letter style found in the Book of Kells. And on the side, on the right-hand side, we can see the exhaustive impressions or drawings he took of the various letters of the alphabet as he found them in these situations. These men, Petrie and the editor of the Annals, O'Donovan, together with Irish scholar Eugene O'Curry, were responsible for a most significant increase in the academic interest in both the language and its form and print, which has endured and forms the basis still of many Celtic and Irish language programs at universities. This was a time of the Great Famine in Ireland. Irish was still the language of the majority, but with the death of more than 1 million of the poorer classes and the emigration of perhaps twice as many more, the language went into a steep decline. Many survivors were driven into a sense of collective repulsion of their uncaring overlords. Next slide, please. A group of rebels, the Young Irelanders, emerged. They were inspired both by the 1798 uprising, which I've just referred to, and the later insurrection of Robert Emmet and the Irish Volunteers, and also by the revolution in France. Their leaders were a scholarly group interested mainly in literary pursuits. Thomas Davis, one of its founding members, was a keen promoter of Irish language and print. He pursued his objective through the establishment of the Nation newspaper and other publications. Now, many of the Young Irelanders, we see 3 of them here on the left in conversation, were associated with the newly established Catholic University of Ireland. Its founder, John Henry Newman, seen here, needed a suitable type for his press. Having been refused use of the round font that just mentioned, which by this time was in the possession of the Protestant University Press at Trinity College, which is an example of the kind of cooperation that didn't exist between both the Protestant institution and the newly formed Catholic one. Religion is at the basis of a lot of this dispute. John Edward Pigott, one of the Young Irelanders, advised him most astutely on the preferred form for his type. He turned also to George Petrie to provide a design, which we see here at the bottom. For inspiration, this time Petrie looked to the more angular, minuscule manuscript style. It was the first type in this popular design to achieve a neutral remove from those calligraphic idiosyncrasies associated with many of its forerunners. It in turn provided a precise model for a number of fonts that followed. This coincided with the development of mechanical typesetting machines that provided for the huge increase in demand from a number of societies that had been formed to promote the Irish language and culture in the lead up to the 20th century. A seamless link followed with the aims of the Gaelic League. Next slide, please. Patrick Pearse, shown here on the left, was a prominent member of the Gaelic League. He was later to become the commander-in-chief of the Easter Rising in 1916. In addition to his many publications of poetry, prose, he took on the role of editor of the League's weekly journal, On Clive's Solace, The Sword of Light, where he also included many such articles of Irish cultural interest, and furthermore, evidence shows that he paid great attention to the typographic considerations involved. He was assisted in this role by another of the 1916 revolutionaries to be, Michael O'Rahilly, seen here on the right. The O'Rahilly, as he was referred to, designed this unusual sans serif typeface for use in the journal for headings and typographic emphasis. He provided these drawings, rather crudely done, I think, to the Monotype Corporation, who issued the font in 1913 as its series 117, shown at the bottom right. Many of the other leaders of the Easter Rising had followed literary careers as well, with some of them operating their own private presses. Next slide, please. Although not a strong advocate of the Rising, Colm O'Loughlin, shown here, was involved in its first military action, namely to destroy a wireless station in West Kerry, in the south of Ireland, to thereby assist in the landing of firearms for the struggle. His interest lay firmly elsewhere, in the areas of Irish language, Irish music, and Irish culture generally. In this same year of 1916, he set up his printing press, later to be named the Three Candles Press, where he rightly gained an international reputation for the high quality of his printing and bookwork. He had this printing type, Columkill, shown on the bottom of the main panel here, prepared with the unstinting commitment of Stanley Morrison of Monotype. He struck up a very close relationship with Morrison, with more than 100 letters passing between them, some of them of a very personal nature, during the development of the typeface. However, the type did not prove popular among Irish printers at the time, with just his press and one other being equipped to offer it. It can be said, therefore, that it was the most discussed and least used typeface of the entire Monotype repertoire. Now, as a separate project, he worked with the Austrian type designer Victor Hammer to adjust his uncial type to make it usable for accompanying display face in Irish. And here we see it at the top of that main panel. Of interest to type designers, perhaps young type designers who work in digital form, the image on the left of this slide might be of interest, for it shows literally the sketches that O'Loughlin did while working on the adjustment of Victor Hammer's uncial to make it usable for Irish. Literally drawn on, it almost looks like it might have been contrived, but it's not, it's genuine, excuse me. Literally drawn on a scrap of newspaper and on the flap of an envelope. Now, the Irish diaspora in the US present an opinion in this context worth noting. With a heightened awareness of their home-based national identity, they insisted that the publishers of The Gale in New York and the Irish Echo in Boston use the most up-to-date Irish character type for their journals also. With the decline in the use of Irish in the 20th century, urgent efforts were made to reverse this trend. Compulsory learning in schools, it being a requirement for state employment, were tried with limited effect. At the same time, a most divisive argument played out, with traditional views favouring the retention of the Irish character, while modernists preferred available Roman type. As late as the 1950s, the Irish character was finally and officially replaced with available Roman type, thus putting an end to the vacillation that surrounded this fascinating typographic dilemma. Now, I suggest that it's no wonder, given the long commitment to this question as I have outlined it, that the language and its form should have played such an important role in the negotiations leading to the 1998 Good Friday Belfast Agreement. and it still remains a most controversial issue in the north of Ireland today. Now, in conclusion, now at a time when competitive national, next slide please, national brand marketing has taken on such importance, if we look for a typographic identifier for Ireland, we are confronted with American Uncial that gained its prominence in this context through the ease and convenience in 1960s of the rub-down letter set dry transfer lettering system. And we can see how even IBM, who are noted for their strict adherence to their corporate house style, bend a corporate knee to American Uncial as it promoted itself in Ireland. Thank you.
Thank you, Dermot, very much for this journey through topographic of Ireland. We are now moving to Sao Paulo, to Brazil, and I would like to welcome Jade Piaia and Priscila Farias. Jade Piaia is a postdoctoral research at the Visual Design Research Lab at the University of Sao Paulo School of Architecture and Urban Planning. She has experience both as a graphic design lecturer and practitioner. She holds a PhD and a master's degree in visual arts from University of Campinas Art Institute. Her main research interests are typography, print culture, design history, information design, and visual communication. Ms. Priscila Farias is an associate professor and the coordinator of the Visual Design Research Lab at the University of Sao Paulo School of Architecture and Urban Planning. She is the author of several articles and books on typography, semiotics, and design, and is responsible for the digital platform Typographia Polstiana. Dear ladies, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having us here. We are very happy to be able to share results of our research with you. Let me share my screen. It's okay, my screen for you?
Yes, it's fine, Jade.
Thank you, Priscila. My name is Jade Samara Piaia. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Visual Design Research Lab at the University of São Paulo, School of Architecture and Urbanism in São Paulo, Brazil. And Priscila is an associate professor of design at the University of São Paulo and the coordinator of the Visual Design Research Lab. My current research is on a letterpress printing shop called Tipografia Reines Irmãos, the Reines Brothers letterpress printing shop. And this is a part of a larger research on the first 100 years of printing in São Paulo, coordinated by Priscila Farias. I will talk to you today about printed artifacts that the Reines brothers, who were German immigrants, produced for immigrant communities established in São Paulo in the late 19th and early 20th century. During the first 100 years of printing in São Paulo, between 1827 and 1927, many immigrants arrived and settled communities in the city, among which their cultures and language were preserved. The Reines Brothers letterpress printing shop was founded by German immigrants Heinrich and Theodor Reines in 1891 and passed on to 3 generations, being active for 100 years until the late 20th century. In 1888, the Reines brothers, then about 20 years old, arrived in Argentina, coming from Bremen, Germany, and traveled to Brazil soon after. Like other immigrants, they both with them equipment, knowledge, and certain expectations towards the visual aspects of printed artifacts. The contribution of German immigrants to São Paulo city print culture was particularly important given Germany's long typographic tradition. Most of the machinery and equipment used by the Reines brothers was imported from their homeland. The starting point of our research on the Haynes brothers was a small collection of photos, prints, and administrative documents that Heinrich and Theodor Haynes descendants landed to the Visual Design Research Lab. Because there was no other collection of artifacts produced by the printers, it was necessary to visit different libraries and archives in order to find their publications. Pages of the publications were digitized using scanners or cameras, or digitizing services offered by the libraries and archives themselves. More than 430 printed documents produced by the Haynes were identified, most of them in collections in São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, but the data gathered also includes items found in archives in southern Brazil and in other countries such as Portugal and Latvia. Most of the publications produced by the Haynes brothers letterpress print shop were in Portuguese, but they also typeset and published in other languages and writing systems. 20 of all Haynes publications so far identified are in German, 89 items, and 18%, 78 items are in other languages such as French, Italian, Latvian, and Arabic. The Haynes employed regimented borders for publications in German, most of them for educational associations, issued from the late 19th to the first half of the 20th century. Colored paper was used in publications such as those for the German Hospital Association and the German Evangelical Congregation. They also often employ geometric or ornamented frames around centralized graphic elements, as we can see here and in the examples before. The cover of the annual report of the board of the German aid organization, Kaiser Wilhelm Foundation, on the left, is a rare example of a publication in two colors, blue and gold. The typeface Künstler Schrift was in constant use for titles of books published in German, as we can see in the details of selected covers on the right. This typeface evokes a certain modernization of German black letter styles, presenting an organic structure with fluid curvilinear shapes and rounded ends, reminiscent of Jugendstil, the naturalistic forms. Coincidence in the visual elements adopted in those publications demonstrates an effort to select a specific repertoire. These publications had a clearly defined audience, and their aesthetic and graphic qualities helped to define a certain German identity for the German immigrant community in Brazil. Here we see covers of two weekly newspapers printed for the Italian community in the late 19th century. Il Lavoro, the work published by the Italian Immigration and Work Center, and L'Assino Umano, the Woman Donkey, an anarchist publication described by its editors as an illustrated rag. Both publications employed mostly serif typeface and little ornamentation. Il Lavoro featured texts and illustrations dealing with labor rights and immigrants' work. L'Assino Umano featured satirical and provocative text and illustration. Both newspapers employed a variety of typeface for the ads published in the last page. The weekly newspaper Eco Português, published in 1897, was focused on the Portuguese community. Its title was set in a typeface very similar to the one adopted for Il Lavoro, but it had a more sober design, parsimoniously making use of ornaments and vignettes, and with a profusion of fantasy typeface in the advertisements page. The Dominics was a pioneering Latvian newspaper. This was as far as we could ascertain, the first artifact printed in Latvian language in São Paulo and in Brazil. The newspaper, edited by Latvian immigrant Júlio Malvis, circulated between 1907 and 1909, coinciding with the beginnings of Latvian immigration to São Paulo state. The issues have 4 pages with some photographs. Text was set in 4 columns with a serif typeface. It's remarkable that the newspaper is set with Antiqua typeface only, rather than Fracture, most commonly used by Latvians in that period. Fantasy typefaces were employed in headlines and in the advertisements found in the last pages. Printers' fists, geometric and floral ornaments were frequently used. Frames in Jugendstil style were extensively employed to differentiate ads in the last page. Changes in the newspaper layout done in the last year of its publication, 1909, included a different arrangement of elements, information hierarchy, alignment, and typeface, but still with no fracture in sight. Some publications demonstrate the heinous engagement with the Arab immigrant community. Graziella, a 1852 novel by French author Alphonse de Lamartine, featuring an eponymous Italian character, was translated to Arabic and printed in 1911. The book was catalogued by the Brazilian National Library with the title Graziella, and the database recorded did not contain any indication that it was printed in another language. It was a surprise to open the book. The front cover, printed in Arabic on the right, is less ornamented than the last cover on the left, with information in Portuguese. All the inner pages were composed with Arabian types. O Oriente was a magazine aimed at the Syrian and Lebanese community in São Paulo, printed by the Haynes in the 1940s. The vast majority of editions carried images of women in the front cover in full color. Edited by Musa Kurayen, this was a bilingual monthly publication with texts in Portuguese and Arabic. Syrian and Lebanese immigrant community parties, personalities, and weddings were frequently featured in the magazine. The Lebanese typographer Habib Muhammad was hired by the Haynes exclusively for typesetting this magazine in 1948. The fourth cover in Arabic is actually the first cover for readers of this language. The Haynes repertoire of Arabic typeface was wide. Text and display typeface are used in advertisements with variation in size, weight, and contrast. Publications for other immigrant communities include the annual report of the Helvetia Swiss Association, a charitable society, initially printed in German, and this book printed in French in 1892, a biography of Estevão Leão Burro, Brazilian journalist, lawyer, and politician of French descent. The Haynes also published at least one booklet in Latin, the Brazilian Central Mission Catalog, shown here in 1919 for the Catholic Church. Brazil Magazine, the last example, was published in multiple languages: Portuguese, French, English, and German. The publications presented here and in the slides before give a sense of the multilingual population of São Paulo City in the late 19th and early 20th century. It must have been a real challenge for letterpress printers such as the Haynes to address the needs and tastes of such a diverse audience. The urgency of investigating migrant print culture is latent. Much of what was published in Brazil in the 9th century has been lost or is in poor condition, especially ephemera and periodicals. The research presented here contributes to print culture and graphic memory studies by identifying trends and indicating possible relations between printers and immigrant communities. Our investigation is supported by FAPESP, São Paulo Research Foundation, and CNPq, Brazilian Research Council, research grants. If you have any question or would like to collaborate in any way, please feel free to contact me. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jaja. Thank you very much. We heard all our three presenters and have enough time for questions. So I have one question for Perzida. Were Slavic prints published also in other Italian cities or only in Venice?
Yes, of course, there were in other cities, but actually I missed the crucial point when I talked about this typography. For example, Rome, we had typographies, but they were published by the permission of Propaganda Fide. The Orthodox Illyrians needed a typography, they wanted to publish their things without asking for permission, actually without censorship. There was a Illyrian commission after, and all the books published for the Illyrians had to pass through the censorship. This typography, Theodosius typography, actually was the only one that could publish without censorship the books they wanted to. I mean, he was a businessman. He was very pragmatic. So in that way, they found their sort of really paradise, publishing paradise, so they could publish without any censorship. That's a crucial, actually, point of the whole presentation, and I missed it. I missed to underline that aspect.
Okay, thank you. And I have two questions for Dermot. First one.
Welcome.
What was the Elizabethan type modeled on? Were there pre-existing writings?
Yes, the Elizabethan type, Queen Elizabeth type, as they call it, used a Roman type of Pierre Houghton, who was already well established as a type cutter on the continent. And some Irish characters were added to that to give it that Irish appearance. And they were produced by some Irish people studying at, I think, Oxford at the time. And their designs were added. That is the D, the unusual D, the G, and just a few characters that were added in the style of Pierre Houghton's Roman. Does that take care of that question? Yeah.
Okay, then another question. Were Irish imageries able to access and use Irish type in their work, striving for Irish independence when working outside Ireland? Did the British state seek to repress the use of Irish type?
I gather you mean in more recent times by that question. Well, in the early days, as I say, with the Franciscan types, they were most concerned about the use of the press in Louvain, in the Irish College in Louvain. But in more recent times, much of the printing, in fact, of Irish was done with typefaces that were produced in England, because Ireland didn't have a very vibrant type founding industry on the island. So it was with English typefaces produced for Irish setting that the printing was done, and much of the printing done to meet the requirements of the Irish living in Britain. A number of journals printed in Irish language there, and as in the US, as I pointed out, at the Irish Echo and the Gale, both produced there using Irish types brought in from both Dublin and from the Figgins, and later as typesetting machines took over, set themselves on their monotype and linotype setting machines. Also in Australia, there were a number of, well, at least one Irish language journal that used the American Type Founders version of Irish type. Yeah.
Thank you. Something else you want to add?
No, I'm happy that if I understood the question correctly, I think that answers it. But if not, perhaps they could come back and ask me to further elaborate. I'd be happy to.
Okay. We are on the schedule. It's 5 minutes to 2:30. So I would like to thank you all for this session, and we are coming back in a few minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.